There comes a moment in every person's life when they must choose between what is expected and what is right. For Astrid, that moment came during what should have been a celebration. The winter feast filled the longhouse with warmth and laughter, but she sat alone, feeling forgotten. At 53, the former shield-maiden watched younger warriors share tales of glory while she nursed her ale in silence. Then she heard something others missed, soft cries coming from behind the walls. Following the sound, she found a young prisoner, barely 18, hidden and beaten. He was the son of a man who had once betrayed her clan. Now she faced an impossible choice. Would showing mercy to her enemy's child prove her wisdom, or would it mark her as a fool who had grown too soft with age? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The memory stones stood like silent sentries in the center of Nordmark village, their ancient surfaces carved deep with the names of ancestors and the blood debts that bound generations. Astrid paused before them each morning, running weathered fingers across familiar grooves that told the story of her people. The winter wind cut through the settlement with merciless precision, carrying the scent of snow and wood smoke from dozens of chimneys that rose like prayers into the grey sky. 20 years had passed since she last raised a sword in anger, yet Astrid could still feel the phantom weight of her shield against her left arm. The battle-worn oak disc now hung forgotten on the wall of her modest dwelling, its iron boss tarnished and its leather grip cracked from seasons of neglect. Once, that shield had turned aside Saxon blades and deflected Danish arrows. Once, warriors had sought her counsel before raids and looked to her for courage when death seemed certain. Now, she spent her days tending to and her father's failing body and feeding livestock that grew lean on winter hay. The transformation from feared shield-maiden to village caretaker had happened gradually, like the slow retreat of a tide that leaves only memories of deeper waters. Her hands, once steady enough to thread a needle through chainmail rings, now trembled slightly as she ladled broth into her father's wooden bowl. "You're thinking too much again," Gunnar observed from the doorway, stamping snow from his boots before entering. Her nephew possessed the broad shoulders and keen eyes of their bloodline, but at 32, he still carried himself with the eager restlessness of youth. His presence filled the small dwelling, making the space feel even more cramped than usual. "Someone must think," Astrid replied, not looking up from her father's bedside. The old man's breathing came shallow and labored, each exhale a visible puff in the cold air. "Thinking kept me alive long enough to grow old." Gunnar settled onto the wooden bench beside the hearth, his sword belt creaking with familiar comfort. "Jarl Erik wants to know if you'll attend the Yule feast tomorrow night. He says the village would be honored by your presence." The invitation carried weight beyond mere courtesy. In Norse society, to be specifically invited by the Jarl meant recognition, respect, things that had been slipping away from Astrid like water through cupped palms. Yet the prospect of sitting among warriors who saw her as a relic from their grandfather's time held little appeal. "I suppose I should," she said finally, "if only to remind people that I haven't died yet." "You're not that old," Gunnar protested, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "Many shield maidens fought well into their 6th decade. Many shield maidens died well before their 6th decade, Astrid corrected. "I've outlived my usefulness, nephew. The young ones look at me and see what they hope never to. Become a warrior without wars to fight." The bitter truth of it settled between them like ash from a cold fire. Nordmark had enjoyed relative peace for the past 5 years, long enough for a new generation to emerge that knew conflict only through stories told around hearth fires. These younger warriors spoke of raids and battles with romantic fervor, having never felt the weight of a dying friend in their arms or watched blood freeze on winter ground. Her father stirred, his eyes opening to fix on some distant memory, visible only to him. "Freydis," he whispered, the name carrying across the room like a prayer. "Freydis, the ships are coming." Astrid's chest tightened. Freydis had been her shield sister, her closest friend, her partner in countless battles across 3 kingdoms. They had sworn oaths to die together if the gods willed it, to share whatever fate awaited in the halls of Valhalla. Instead, Freydis had died alone in an ambush 20 years past, betrayed by information that should never have reached enemy ears. "He speaks of her often," Gunnar said quietly. "The fever brings back old memories. Old memories are all he has left," Astrid replied, adjusting the fur blankets around her father's frail form. "Sometimes I think they're clearer to him than the present moment." The sound of approaching footsteps announced another visitor. Ingrid the Wise entered without ceremony, her healer's bag slung across one shoulder and her grey hair braided with bone beads that clicked softly as she moved. At 67, she commanded respect that transcended gender or age. Her knowledge of herbs and healing had saved more lives than many warriors had taken. "How fares he today?" Ingrid asked, settling beside the bed with practiced efficiency. "The same," Astrid replied, "perhaps a little weaker." Ingrid's examination was thorough but gentle, her experienced hands checking pulse points and breathing patterns with the skill of decades. Her diagnosis came, without sugarcoating. The winter fever grows stronger. His body fights, but it's an old body, tired from many battles. The words hung in the air like a death sentence delivered with kindness. Astrid had seen enough men die to recognize the signs, but hearing it spoken aloud made her father's mortality feel suddenly urgent. "How long?" she asked. "Days, perhaps weeks if the gods are merciful. The cold makes everything harder for one his age." After Ingrid departed with promises to return the following morning, Astrid found herself alone with her thoughts and her dying father. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the whisper of wind through the roof, thatch, and the distant sounds of village life continuing its ancient rhythms. Nordmark nestled in a valley between protective hills, its longhouses arranged in careful patterns that spoke of generations of thoughtful planning. Each family's dwelling reflected their status and history. The Jarl's hall dominated the settlement's heart, while smaller structures housed craftsmen, farmers, and those who served the community in various capacities. Smoke rose from every chimney, creating a forest of grey columns that merged with the overcast sky. The village thrived despite the harsh conditions, its people bound together by shared ancestry and common purpose. Trade routes brought goods from distant lands, amber from the Baltic shores, silver from Arab merchants, iron from Swedish mines. Warriors returned from successful raids bearing treasure and stories, their successes becoming part of the collective memory that defined who they were as a people. Yet beneath this prosperity lay currents of tension that only the observant could detect. The memory stones recorded not just lineages, but grievances. Blood feuds that stretched back generations and required careful navigation to avoid reigniting old conflicts. Trust was a precious commodity, earned through years of proven loyalty and lost in moments of perceived betrayal. Astrid understood these dynamics better than most, having lived through the consequences of broken faith. The great betrayal 20 years ago had cost the lives of 37 warriors, including Freydis and a dozen others she had called friends. The man responsible, Ragnar the Redbeard, had vanished after providing information to Saxon forces that turned a routine raid into a carefully planned massacre. His betrayal had cut deep wounds in the village's sense of security, making them suspicious of outsiders and quick to judge those who might threaten their safety. As evening approached, the sounds of preparation for the next day's feast echoed through the settlement. The Yule celebration would mark the winter solstice, the turning point, when days would begin growing longer and spring would start its slow return. It was a time for community, for honoring the gods and ancestors, for strengthening the bonds that held their society together through the darkest months. Astrid watched through her small window as young warriors practiced sword forms in the fading light, their movements precise and confident. They fought shadow enemies with the enthusiasm of those who had never faced real steel, never felt the spray of arterial blood across their faces, or heard the final breath leave a friend's lungs. Part of her envied their innocence. Another part feared for their future. Her father's labored breathing provided a constant reminder of mortality's approach. He had been a formidable warrior in his youth, leading raids from Ireland to the Baltic Sea. His reputation had opened doors and earned respect that extended to his daughter, helping establish Astrid's own standing among the shield-maidens. Without his support, her path would have been far more difficult. Now he lay dying, while she struggled to find purpose in a world that seemed to have moved beyond her relevance. The young warriors respected her history but did not seek her counsel. The village women appreciated her skills, but saw her as someone who had chosen an unusual path rather than embracing traditional roles. She existed in a space between worlds, belonging fully to neither. The fire in their hearth burned low, casting dancing shadows across the walls, where her weapons hung like relics from another age. Her sword, her axe, her CX, each tool, had served her well in its time, but they seemed alien now, artifacts from a life that felt increasingly distant. The muscle memory remained. She could still move through combat forms with deadly grace when alone and unwatched. Yet what use were fighting skills in times of peace? Tomorrow's feast would gather the entire village in celebration, creating an opportunity to observe the complex social dynamics that governed their community. Astrid would attend out of obligation and tradition, playing the role expected of an honored elder. She would listen to stories she had heard countless times, nod appreciatively at boasts from warriors half her age, and pretend that the weight of accumulated years did not press upon her shoulders like chainmail made of regret. The night deepened around Nordmark, bringing with it the kind of cold that seemed to seep through flesh and settle in the bones. Astrid banked the fire for the long hours ahead and settled into the chair beside her father's bed, keeping vigil through another night of uncertain breathing and fevered dreams. Outside, the wind sang old songs through the eaves, carrying secrets and sorrows across the frozen landscape toward whatever dawn might bring. The great horn sounded 3 times across Nordmark, its deep voice echoing off the valley walls to announce the beginning of the Yule feast. Astrid wrapped her finest cloak around her shoulders, wool dyed deep blue with precious indigo, a gift from raiding days when such luxuries came easily. The fabric still held its color well, though the edges showed wear that spoke of careful preservation, rather than frequent use. She made her way through the village, as darkness settled over the snow-covered ground. Torches lined the path to the Jarl's longhouse, their flames dancing in the winter wind and casting shifting pools of golden light across the trampled earth. The sounds of celebration already spilled from the great hall, laughter, conversation, the rhythmic pounding of drinking horns against wooden tables. The longhouse stood as the heart of Nordmark, its massive oak beams carved with intricate patterns that told the story of the settlement's founding. Dragons and wolves intertwined along the pillars, their eyes inlaid with amber that gleamed like captured fire. The building could hold the entire village when necessary, its long central space dominated by fire pits that provided both warmth and light for gatherings such as this. Astrid paused at the threshold, steeling herself for what lay ahead. Through the open doors, she could see the feast already in full swing. Warriors occupied the benches closest to the high table, their places of honor earned through recent deeds and current favor. Craftsmen and farmers filled the middle sections, while the elderly and infirm were relegated to spots near the walls where the warmth barely reached. She found herself guided to a bench among the village elders, a placement that stung more than she cared to admit. Old Thormund the Lame nodded in greeting, his battle-scarred face creased in what might have been sympathy. Beside him sat Helga Ironhand, a former shield-maiden whose fighting days had ended when a Saxon blade shattered her sword arm. The message was clear: they were the remnants, the survivors who had outlived their usefulness. Jarl Erik rose from his carved chair to offer the traditional blessing, his voice carrying easily across the crowded hall. At 45, he commanded through a combination of inherited authority and proven leadership, his decisions shaped by careful consideration of tradition and practical necessity. His words honored the gods, the ancestors, and the bonds that held their community together through winter's hardships. The feast proceeded with familiar rhythms. Servants brought platters of roasted meat, bowls of barley bread, and drinking horns filled with ale that had been brewing since autumn's end. The smell of cooked food mingled with wood smoke, and the less pleasant odors of too many bodies crowded into a confined space. Yet there was warmth here beyond the physical, the warmth of belonging, of shared identity, of connections forged through generations of common struggle. Young warriors began sharing tales of their recent exploits, their voices growing louder as the ale flowed more freely. Bjorn Iron Fist recounted a raid against Danish settlements, emphasizing his own role in capturing 3 ships laden with silver. Olaf the Tall described a trading expedition that had nearly ended in battle when Saxon merchants attempted to cheat them of promised goods. Each story followed familiar patterns, highlighting courage, cunning, and loyalty to their clan. Astrid listened with half her attention while observing the complex social dynamics at play. Alliances were reinforced through shared cups and supportive laughter. Rivalries simmered beneath polite conversation, expressed through subtle slights and pointed omissions. The younger generation performed for their elders, while simultaneously establishing their own hierarchies based on recent accomplishments. It was during Gunnar's account of a successful hunt that Astrid first heard the sound, a faint noise that seemed to come from somewhere behind the carved wall panels. She paused with her drinking horn halfway to her lips, straining to identify what had caught her attention. The sound came again, barely audible above the celebration's din, a soft cry, muffled and desperate. She glanced around to see if others had noticed, but the feast continued without interruption. Warriors laughed at Gunnar's description of cornering a massive boar in a snow-filled ravine. Servants moved efficiently between the tables, refilling cups and clearing empty platters. The elders beside her nodded along with conversations they had heard countless variations of before. The cry came a third time, clearer now that she was listening for it. It carried a quality of youth and pain that made her stomach tighten with recognition. She had heard similar sounds during raids, the voices of captives, prisoners taken in battle who awaited whatever fate their captors deemed appropriate. Astrid set down her drinking horn and rose from the bench, claiming a need for fresh air. The excuse drew little attention. Elderly bladders were weak, and winter nights were long. She made her way toward the rear of the longhouse, following the wall that separated the main hall from the storage areas and servant quarters. The sound led her to a section where the carved panels seemed older than the rest, their dragon motifs worn smooth by countless hands. She pressed her ear against the wood, listening intently. The crying had stopped, but she could hear something else breathing, labored and frightened. Her fingers explored the panel's edges, searching for the mechanism she suspected must exist. Norse builders were clever, often incorporating hidden spaces for storing valuables or providing emergency exits. After several minutes of careful probing, she found a section that yielded slightly to pressure. The panel swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a narrow chamber carved from the earth beneath the longhouse. The space was barely large enough for a person to sit upright, its walls lined with rough stone that wept moisture in the underground cold. Iron rings set into the walls supported chains and shackles that spoke eloquently of the chamber's purpose. It was a place for holding prisoners, likely built when the longhouse was constructed as insurance against future needs. Huddled in the far corner sat a young man who could not have seen more than 18 summers. His clothes hung in tatters, stained with blood and filth that suggested days of captivity. Chains secured his wrists to the wall rings, the iron wearing raw wounds where he had struggled against his bonds. His face bore the unmistakable marks of recent violence: swollen lips, blackened eyes, a nose that had been broken and poorly set. Yet it was his features that made Astrid's breath catch in her throat. The bone structure, the shape of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead, all carried echoes of a face she had hoped never to see again. 20 years had passed since Ragnar the Redbeard's betrayal, but his son bore enough resemblance to make identification certain. The young man looked up at her approach, his eyes wide with terror that spoke of recent brutalities. He tried to speak but managed only a croak through what was clearly a damaged throat. The chains rattled as he pressed himself further into the corner, expecting fresh violence from this unexpected visitor. "Easy," Astrid whispered, raising her hands to show they were empty. "I'm not here to harm you." Understanding flickered in his eyes, though fear remained the dominant emotion. He was foreign, that much was clear from his clothing and the way he held himself. His skin bore the pallor of someone from northern climates, but his garments suggested origins beyond the Norse lands. A captive taken in some recent raid, brought back to await whatever judgment the village might render. But why was he hidden here, imprisoned in secret, rather than displayed openly, as raid spoils typically were? The answer came with sickening clarity as she studied his face more closely. Someone had recognized him as Ragnar's son and decided that public knowledge of his presence would complicate whatever plans they had for his fate. The young man tried again to speak, producing sounds that might have been words in some foreign tongue. His desperation was palpable, the kind of raw need that transcended language barriers. He was asking for help, for mercy, for any sign that his situation might improve. Astrid crouched beside him, careful to move slowly and avoid triggering fresh panic. This close, she could see the full extent of his injuries. Bruises that painted his skin in purple and yellow, cuts that had been left to fester, the shallow breathing that suggested possible broken ribs. Someone had worked him over systematically, extracting information or simply expressing their hatred for his bloodline. "Who are you?" She asked quietly, though she suspected the answer would only confirm her fears. He managed a single word, spoken with great effort. "Björn." The name hit her like a physical blow. Björn bare a fitting name for Ragnar's son, though this broken young man showed little resemblance to the fierce beast his name suggested. She studied his face again, looking beyond the immediate damage to see the person beneath. There was intelligence in his eyes, and something else, a quality of gentleness that seemed at odds with his father's reputation for ruthless calculation. The sound of renewed laughter from the main hall reminded Astrid of where she was and how little time she had before her absence would be noticed. Discovery here would demand explanations she was not prepared to give, decisions she had not yet made. The smart choice would be to return to the feast, pretend she had never found this hidden chamber, and let others determine Björn's fate. Yet as she looked into his frightened eyes, she found herself remembering another face, Freydis, dying in the snow 20 years ago, her life's blood painting the ground red, while Astrid held her close and whispered meaningless comfort. Ragnar's betrayal had cost them both dearly, creating wounds that had never fully healed. Now his son sat chained in darkness, awaiting whatever judgment his father's sins had earned. The circle was complete, the debt ready for collection. All it would take was walking away, letting nature take its course, allowing the village to exact whatever justice they deemed appropriate. Instead, Astrid found herself reaching for the chains that bound Björn's wrists, her decision made before her mind could fully process its implications. Some choices transcended logic, reaching into deeper places where conscience dwelt alongside memory and regret. The iron was old but strong, secured with locks that would require keys she did not possess. Yet the rings set into the walls showed signs of age and moisture damage that might provide opportunities for someone with patience and proper tools. For now, she could only offer what comfort words might provide. "I'm going to help you," she told him, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "I don't know how yet, but I won't leave you here to die." Bjorn's expression shifted from terror toward something, approaching hope, though wariness remained. Trust would have to be earned gradually, built through actions rather than promises. For now, it was enough that someone had acknowledged his humanity, had seen him as more than just the son of a traitor. The feast continued in the main hall, its sounds providing cover for this unexpected encounter. Astrid knew she would have to return soon, play her assigned role among the elderly, while her mind raced with the implications of what she had discovered. Sleep would not come easily this night, if it came at all. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices that would test everything she thought she understood about honor, justice, and the weight of inherited sins. For tonight, it was enough to have chosen mercy over revenge, compassion over the easier path of willful blindness. Dawn came pale and cold over Nordmark, bringing with it the kind of clarity that made difficult decisions seem both inevitable and impossible. Astrid had slept poorly, her mind churning through the implications of what she had discovered beneath the longhouse. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Björn's terrified face superimposed over memories of his father, the man whose betrayal had cost so many lives, including that of her dearest friend. She rose before full light, moving quietly to avoid waking her father, whose breathing had grown more labored during the night. The morning routine of tending the fire and preparing thin gruel gave her hands something to do, while her thoughts wrestled with the problem of how to help a young man whose very existence threatened to reopen old wounds that had never properly healed. In the cold storage area behind their dwelling, she gathered supplies that would not be immediately missed: strips of dried meat, a small wheel of cheese, clean cloth that could serve as bandages. Her movements were deliberate and careful, each choice weighed against the risk of discovery. Taking too much would raise questions. Taking too little might prove insufficient for Björn's needs. Hidden beneath folded blankets lay a reminder of the past she had tried to forget. Ragnar's broken sword hilt rested in an oiled cloth wrapper, its ornate bronze work tarnished, but still recognizable. She had kept it as evidence of his treachery, proof of the man who had sold their trust for Saxon silver. Now the artifact felt like an accusation, its weight heavier than the metal justified. 20 years had passed since that terrible morning when she and Freydis had led 37 warriors toward what they believed would be a simple raid on a Saxon monastery. The intelligence had seemed reliable. Ragnar himself had provided it, claiming contact with sympathetic locals who described minimal defenses and rich treasures waiting for bold Norsemen to claim. Instead, they had walked into a carefully planned ambush. Saxon furdmen had waited in concealment while archers took positions in the surrounding trees. The attack had come at dawn, arrows whistling from hidden positions, while armored warriors emerged from ditches and ruins to cut off all paths of retreat. Freydis had died early in the fighting, an arrow through her throat that dropped her without a sound. Astrid had watched her shield sister fall while she herself was locked in combat with a Saxon lord whose expensive mail and decorated weapons marked him as nobility. The battle had been chaos, screaming, bleeding, dying in a foreign land far from the halls they called home. Only 12 had survived to limp back to Nordmark, bearing news of the disaster and the growing suspicion that they had been deliberately betrayed. The evidence had mounted quickly: Ragnar's sudden disappearance, his absence from the raiding party despite initially volunteering to guide them, testimony from survivors about Saxon preparations that suggested advance warning. The broken sword hilt had been found at his abandoned dwelling, snapped in what appeared to be rage or desperation. Some claimed he had tried to destroy evidence of his treachery. Others suggested it represented his recognition of the dishonor his actions had brought upon his name. Either way, it had become a symbol of betrayal that cut deep wounds in the village's sense of security. Now his son sat chained in darkness, bearing the physical resemblance that marked him as clearly as any runic inscription. The temptation to leave him there, to let others discover him and exact whatever justice they deemed appropriate, remained strong. It would be so much easier to walk away, to pretend she had never heard those muffled cries or looked into those frightened eyes. Yet something in Bjorn's expression had spoken to her a quality of innocence that seemed genuine, untainted by his father's sins. He was young, perhaps no older than some of the warriors who had died in that Saxon ambush. Did the crimes of the father automatically transfer to the son? The question had kept her awake through the long hours before dawn. With her gathered supplies hidden beneath her cloak, Astrid made her way through the village as the settlement began stirring to life. Smoke rose from chimneys as families rekindled their fires and began preparing the day's first meal. The sounds of morning routines, children's voices, livestock demanding attention, the ring of hammer on anvil from the smith's workshop provided familiar comfort that made her clandestine mission feel even more dangerous. The longhouse stood quiet in the morning light, its celebration from the previous evening, leaving behind only scattered rushes and the lingering smell of spilled ale. She waited until she was certain no one was watching before slipping around to the rear wall, where the hidden panel waited behind its carved dragon facade. The mechanism worked as smoothly as before, swinging inward to reveal the narrow chamber where Bjorn huddled in his chains. He looked up at her approach with an expression that mixed hope with continued wariness, his injuries even more apparent in the dim light that filtered through the opening. "I brought food," Astrid said quietly, showing him the supplies she had gathered, "and clean cloth for your wounds." His attempt at gratitude came out as a whisper, his damaged throat making speech painful. She knelt beside him, offering water-first clean liquid that he drank with desperate thirst, some of it spilling down his chin as his chained hands made normal movement difficult. The dried meat required patience, small pieces torn off and chewed slowly by someone whose mouth bore fresh cuts from recent violence. She watched him eat with the careful attention of someone who had tended wounded warriors, noting signs that spoke of systematic brutality rather than random cruelty. "Who did this to you?" she asked when he had managed to consume enough to ease his immediate hunger. Bjorn's response came in halting words, his voice barely audible, above the morning sounds filtering through the wall. The language was foreign but similar enough to Norse that she could pick out meaning. He spoke of being captured during a raid, of being recognized by someone who knew his father's face, but of interrogation that had yielded little because he knew nothing of value to tell. As she cleaned his wounds with the cloth and water she had brought, a fuller picture began to emerge. He had been living as a wanderer, selling his skills as a healer and craftsman in exchange for food and shelter. His mother, a foreign woman Ragnar had taken as a wife during his exile, had died the previous winter, leaving him with only fragmentary knowledge of his Norse heritage. "I didn't know about my father," he managed to say, the words costing him obvious effort. "Not until they told me, not until they showed me his sword." The broken hilt she had wrapped and hidden felt suddenly heavier in memory. How much of Ragnar's story did this young man know? How much truth lay buried beneath 20 years of assumption and justified anger? "What do you know about him?" she asked carefully. Bjorn's answer came slowly, punctuated by pauses as he gathered strength to continue. His mother had told him stories of a Norse warrior who had loved her but been forced to leave due to some terrible mistake. She had spoken of Ragnar with sadness rather than hatred, describing a man tormented by choices that had cost him everything he valued. The revelation struck Astrid like a physical blow. If Bjorn's mother had known the truth about the betrayal, surely she would have spoken differently about the man responsible. Unless the thought was almost too dangerous to consider, unless there was more to Ragnar's story than the survivors had understood. "My father left me this," Bjorn whispered, producing from beneath his torn clothing a small pendant that had somehow escaped his captor's notice. The bronze disc bore runic inscriptions that were difficult to read in the dim light, but Astrid could make out words that spoke of regret, of choices made for love rather than gain. The implications began to reshape her understanding of events she had considered settled history. What if Ragnar's betrayal had been something other than simple greed? What if there were circumstances she and the other survivors had never known about, factors that might cast his actions in a different light? Yet even if that were true, it would not bring Freydis back or restore the lives lost in that Saxon ambush. The dead were beyond the reach of revised understanding, their sacrifice unchanged by new information about the man whose intelligence had led them into that trap. The sound of voices from the main hall warned her that others would soon be stirring, ending this opportunity for private conversation. She gathered her supplies and prepared to leave, promising to return when she could do so safely. "Why are you helping me?" Björn asked as she prepared to close the panel. The question deserved an honest answer, though she was not certain she fully understood her own motivations. "Because you're not your father," she said finally. "And because I'm tired of carrying hatred that serves no purpose except to poison the carrier." As she made her way back through the awakening village, Astrid found herself questioning assumptions she had held for 2 decades. Perhaps it was time to examine the past with older, wiser eyes, to look beyond the pain of loss toward whatever truth might still be discovered. The silver arm ring had been Freydis's most precious possession, a gift from her grandmother that bore intricate knotwork patterns passed down through generations of shield-maidens. Astrid turned the gleaming band over in her weathered hands, feeling the familiar weight that had become both comfort and torment over the past 20 years. She wore it now only on special occasions, when the memory of her lost shield sister felt particularly close. 3 days had passed since her first encounter with Björn, and each visit to his hidden prison had revealed more about the young man who bore such a striking resemblance to his treacherous father. Unlike Ragnar, whose charm had masked calculating ambition, Björn possessed a gentleness that seemed genuine, almost naive in its openness. "Tell me about your mother," Astrid said as she unwrapped fresh bread and a small pot of honey she had managed to take from her own meager stores. The village had begun to notice the disappearance of food supplies, though no one had yet connected the thefts to her daily absences. Björn's throat had healed enough to allow normal speech, though his voice remained rough from the abuse he had suffered. "Her name was Sigrid," he said, accepting the food with gratitude that never seemed to diminish despite her regular visits. "She came from the eastern lands, beyond the great rivers where the Rus trade with distant kingdoms." As he spoke, Astrid found herself drawn into stories of a life lived far from Norse traditions. Sigrid had been a healer, skilled in the use of herbs and remedies unknown to northern peoples. She had taught her son the arts of medicine alongside the basic warrior skills that any man needed to survive in a dangerous world. "She never spoke ill of my father," Björn continued, carefully spreading honey on the coarse bread with fingers that still bore the marks of his chains. "Even when times were hardest, when we had little food or safe shelter, she would tell me stories of the brave Norse warrior who had loved her but been forced to leave." The revelation sat uncomfortably with Astrid's memories of Ragnar as a calculating betrayer who had sold his kinsman's lives for Saxon gold. Yet the pendant Björn wore suggested a more complex truth, runic inscriptions that spoke of sorrow and impossible choices rather than simple greed. "Did she ever say why he left?" Astrid asked. "Only that he had made a terrible mistake trying to protect people he loved," Björn replied. "She said the mistake cost him everything, his honor, his home, his family. She forgave him for leaving us, but I think she never forgave herself for not being able to help him carry the burden." The words struck deeper than Astrid expected, opening possibilities she had not allowed herself to consider. What if Ragnar's betrayal had been motivated by something other than avarice? What if there were circumstances that might, if not excuse his actions, at least make them understandable? She found herself studying Björn's face as he ate, looking beyond the resemblance to his father toward the individual character that shaped his expressions. There was intelligence there, and compassion, and a kind of moral clarity that reminded her painfully of Freydis in their younger days. "My shield sister would have liked you," she said without thinking, then immediately regretted the words. Shield sister? Björn asked, his curiosity evident despite his precarious situation. Freydis, we fought together for 15 years, through dozens of battles and raids. She was closer to me than blood family. We had sworn oaths to die together if the gods willed it. The pain of loss never fully faded, merely shifted like a poorly healed wound that ached in cold weather. Speaking Freydis's name aloud to Ragnar's son felt like a betrayal of her memory, yet something in Björn's expression invited confidence. She died in the ambush your father arranged, Astrid continued, watching carefully for his reaction. An arrow through her throat while we fought Saxon warriors who had been warned of our coming. Björn's face went pale, his food forgotten as the implications settled upon him. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so very sorry. The genuine distress in his voice caught her off guard. She had expected denial, anger, or defensive justifications. Instead, she saw only grief, not just for Freydis, specifically, but for all the lives lost due to his father's actions. You weren't responsible, she said, surprising herself with the gentleness in her voice. But I carry his blood, Björn replied. His choices cast shadows that reach even to me. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in thoughts of inheritance and consequence. Above them, the sounds of village life continued with normal rhythms, children playing, craftsmen working, the eternal business of survival that occupied every waking hour. It was Björn who broke the silence. Would you tell me about her? About Freydis? The request felt dangerous, like opening a door that had been carefully sealed against painful memories. Yet something in his tone suggested genuine interest rather than morbid curiosity. Perhaps it was time to speak of Freydis to someone who would listen without judgment or the weight of shared grief. She laughed, like summer thunder. Astrid began, the words coming easier than expected. Loud and sudden and impossible to ignore. She could make the grimmest warrior smile with her stories, and she never backed down from a challenge, no matter how dangerous. More memories followed, shared adventures, close escapes, the comfortable camaraderie that had developed between them over years of fighting side by side. Freydis's quick wit, her fierce loyalty, her ability to find humor even in the darkest circumstances. The way she had planned to settle down after one more successful raiding season, to find a good man and raise children who would carry on her strength. She sounds like someone worth mourning, Björn said when the stories finally ended. She was worth living for, Astrid replied. After she died, I lost my way for a while. Fighting didn't seem to matter anymore. Nothing seemed to matter. But you found purpose again? I thought I had. Family duty, caring for my father, accepting my place among the village elders. But sitting here with you, I realize I've been sleepwalking through the years since her death. The admission surprised her with its honesty. She had not realized how much she missed having a purpose beyond mere survival, a reason to face each day with something approaching enthusiasm. Outside, the sounds of the village began to change as afternoon approached evening. Soon, people would be gathering for the evening meal, and her continued absence would become noticeable. Yet she found herself reluctant to leave this strange sanctuary, where past and present intersected in unexpected ways. There's something you should know, she said as she prepared to depart. The village council has been meeting about missing supplies and strange sounds heard near the longhouse. They're growing suspicious. Fear flickered in Björn's eyes, though he tried to hide it. Will you stop coming? The question forced her to confront the growing attachment she felt toward this young man who represented everything she should hate. Logic demanded that she distance herself, protect her own position, avoid the complications that helping him would inevitably create. No, she said, the decision surprising her with its certainty. But we need to be more careful, and we need to start thinking about getting you away from here before they discover you. I have nowhere to go, Björn said quietly. Then we'll find somewhere, Astrid replied, though she had no idea how such a thing might be accomplished. As she made her way back through the village, Freydis's arm ring caught the fading sunlight and threw small rainbows across the snow-covered ground. Perhaps it was time to stop living in the past and start building something that might honor her shield sister's memory, something that chose hope over hatred, mercy over revenge. The path ahead would be dangerous, requiring careful planning and considerable courage. But for the first time in 20 years, Astrid felt truly alive, truly purposeful, truly worthy of the friendship that had shaped the best part of her life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and fresh dangers. Tonight, it was enough to have chosen compassion over the easier path of inherited hatred. Freydis would have understood, perhaps even approved of the choice to see beyond the sins of the father to the potential goodness of the son. The bundle of ancient healing herbs lay spread across Astrid's wooden table like a map to forgotten knowledge. Bjorn's careful hands sorted through the dried plants with practiced expertise, his touch reverent as he identified each specimen by scent and texture. Yarrow for bleeding wounds, willow bark for fever, meadowsweet for pain remedies that Norse healers knew, but also stranger plants whose names came from distant lands. "This one," he said, holding up a twisted root that looked unremarkable to Astrid's eyes. "My mother called it ghost finger. It grows only in the deepest forests of the eastern lands, where the soil is black and rich. 3 drops of its essence can break the highest fever." The timing of this knowledge proved fortunate, for Astrid's father had taken a turn for the worse during the night. His breathing came in shallow gasps that spoke of fluid gathering in his lungs, while his skin burned with heat that seemed to consume him from within. Ingrid's traditional remedies had provided little relief, leaving Astrid desperate enough to risk bringing Bjorn's foreign wisdom into her family's dwelling. "You're certain this will help?" she asked, watching as he prepared the root with tools borrowed from her own kitchen. The process required careful measurement and precise timing that spoke of genuine expertise rather than desperate improvisation. "I've used it many times," Bjorn assured her, his voice steady despite the danger his presence here represented. "My mother taught me that fever is like a fire. Sometimes you must starve it of fuel rather than trying to douse it with water." The transformation from prisoner to prison healer had been remarkable to witness. Away from his chains, provided with purpose and the means to exercise his skills, Bjorn moved with quiet confidence that reminded Astrid of master craftsmen she had known. His gentle handling of her father revealed a bedside manner that combined technical knowledge with genuine compassion. "Hold his head steady," Bjorn instructed as he prepared to administer the medicine. "The taste is bitter, but he needs to swallow every drop." Astrid's father accepted the treatment with the trusting resignation of someone too weak to resist. The medicine went down with difficulty, followed by a honey mixture designed to ease the harsh aftertaste. For long minutes afterward, nothing seemed to change. The labored breathing continued. The fever raged unabated. Then, gradually, something shifted. The old man's breathing became less strained, his skin temperature dropping from burning heat towards something approaching normal warmth. Color returned to his cheeks, replacing the waxy pallor that had made him look already half dead. "How?" Astrid whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was witnessing. "The root teaches the body to fight more efficiently," Bjorn explained, cleaning his borrowed tools with the same care he had shown throughout the process. "It doesn't cure the illness, but it gives the patient's own strength a chance to prevail." The improvement continued over the following hours as they kept vigil beside the sickbed. What had seemed like preparation for final farewells gradually transformed into something approaching recovery. By evening, Astrid's father was able to take weak broth and even spoke a few coherent words, the first clear speech he had managed in days. "Who is this young man?" he asked, his clouded eyes focusing on Bjorn with curiosity rather than alarm. "A friend," Astrid replied carefully, "someone skilled in healing arts." Her father's gaze lingered on Bjorn's face with the intensity of Bjorn's, someone trying to place a half-remembered feature. "You have the look of someone I knew long ago," he said finally. "A good fighter, but troubled by conscience. What was his name? Ragnar something." The words hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread. Astrid felt her breath catch, while Björn went very still beside the bed. Discovery now could prove catastrophic for both of them, yet lying to her dying father seemed equally impossible. "Ragnar the Redbeard," she said quietly. "This is his son." She expected anger, perhaps even violence, despite her father's weakened condition. Instead, the old man's expression grew thoughtful, almost sad. "So young when it happened," he murmured. "Such a waste, so much pain for everyone involved." "You were there during the betrayal?" Björn asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I was supposed to be," Astrid's father replied, "but I took fever the night before departure, kept me from joining the raid that cost so many good lives. I always wondered if I could have made a difference, could have seen what was coming before it was too late." "What do you mean?" Astrid pressed, sensing undercurrents she had never suspected. "Your friend Ragnar came to see me the night before you left," her father continued, his voice growing stronger as memory sharpened his focus. "He was troubled, spoke of impossible choices and the weight of protecting innocence. I thought he was just nervous about the raid. Young warriors often get philosophical before battle." The revelation struck both listeners like physical blows. Astrid had never heard this story, never known that Ragnar had sought counsel from her father on the eve of what would become the great betrayal. "What else did he say?" Björn asked urgently. "Something about children," the old man replied, his brow furrowing with effort. "Saxon children who would die if the raid proceeded as planned. He spoke of intelligence that painted the monastery as defenseless, but other information suggesting a nearby village full of families. He was torn between duty to his kinsmen and horror at what might happen to innocents caught in the fighting." The pieces of a puzzle Astrid had never known existed began to form a different picture of events she thought she understood completely. What if Ragnar's betrayal had been an attempt to prevent a massacre? What if his information to the Saxons had been designed to protect children rather than earn silver? "But our people died," she said, struggling to reconcile this new information with 20 years of justified hatred. "Yes," her father agreed sadly. "Good people, brave warriors, your dear friend Freydis among them. Ragnar's choice saved Saxon children but cost Norse lives. There was no solution that didn't require someone to pay a terrible price." Björn's face had gone pale as the implications settled upon him. His father had not been a simple traitor motivated by greed, but a man faced with an impossible moral choice: let the raid proceed and risk the slaughter of innocents, or warn the enemy and accept responsibility for his kinsmen's deaths. He lived with that choice for the rest of his life, the old man continued. Exiled, hated, carrying the weight of every life lost because of his decision. I often wondered if survival was harder for him than an honorable death would have been. The silence stretched between them as past and present realigned around this new understanding. Astrid found herself remembering details from that final night. Ragnar's distraction, his reluctance to discuss the upcoming raid, the way he had avoided eye contact when wishing them success. Outside, the evening sounds of Nordmark continued with familiar rhythms that seemed suddenly fragile. How many other certainties might prove equally unstable when examined closely? How much truth had been buried beneath convenient assumptions and the very human need to find someone to blame for tragedy? I should return, Björn said finally, though he made no immediate move toward departure. Stay until morning, Astrid's father urged. My daughter needs rest, and I would hear more about your mother's healing knowledge. It's been many years since I learned something truly new. The invitation represented acceptance that went beyond mere tolerance. Here was the closest thing to absolution that Björn was likely to find forgiveness from someone who had lived through the consequences of his father's choice and found room for understanding alongside grief. The Jarl's justice hammer rested on its ceremonial stand in the center of the council chamber, its iron head polished to mirror brightness that reflected the faces of those who would wield it in judgment. Carved runes along its handle spoke of ancient laws and the weight of leadership decisions that could not be unmade once rendered. Eric Bloodaxe had inherited both the weapon and the responsibility it represented from his father, who had received them in turn from generations of leaders stretching back to the settlement's founding. Gunnar stood before the assembled council with the rigid posture of a warrior delivering unwelcome intelligence. His usual easy confidence had been replaced by the uncomfortable tension of someone caught between family loyalty and village duty, a position that offered no comfortable resolution, regardless of which path he chose. "Speak your concerns," Jarl Eric commanded, his voice carrying the authority that made even seasoned warriors straighten their shoulders in response. "My aunt has been acting strangely," Gunnar began, the words clearly costing him effort to speak. "Food has been disappearing from our stores, and she's been making excuses to leave the dwelling at odd hours. Yesterday, I followed her toward the longhouse, but she seemed to sense my presence and changed direction." The council members exchanged glances that spoke of shared suspicion. Times of peace made communities vigilant about internal threats, perhaps more so than external dangers that could be met with sword and shield. A traitor within their walls represented a violation of trust that struck at the very foundation of their society. "You suspect your aunt of what?" "Exactly?" asked Thorvald the Grey, his weathered features creased with concern that went beyond mere curiosity. "I don't know," Gunnar admitted, his honesty making the admission even more troubling. "But something has changed about her since the Yule feast. She speaks differently, acts differently, as if she's carrying some burden that weighs heavily on her conscience." Astrid had indeed been carrying a burden, one that grew heavier with each passing day, as her secret knowledge of Björn's presence created an ever-widening gulf between herself and the community she had served faithfully for decades. The morning's revelation about Ragnar's true motivations had only complicated matters further, replacing simple hatred with a complex mixture of understanding and continued grief. She had left Björn in her father's care while she attended to village business that could no longer be postponed. The sight of the council in serious discussion filled her with immediate dread. Too much of their body language suggested they were discussing threats to community security. "Ah, Astrid," Jarl Eric said as she approached, "your nephew has been sharing his concerns about your recent behavior. Perhaps you could help us understand what might be troubling you." The question felt like a trap closing around her, each word carefully chosen to probe for weakness while maintaining the pretense of casual inquiry. She found herself studying faces she had known for decades, looking for signs of how much they suspected and how much danger her choices had created. "I've been caring for my dying father," she replied carefully. "Perhaps that explains any changes Gunnar has noticed." "Of course," the Jarl agreed, though his tone suggested skepticism. "Yet there have been reports of missing supplies throughout the village: food, medicine, cloth suitable for bandages. Small amounts from many households, taken in ways that suggest deliberate concealment rather than casual borrowing." The net was tightening with methodical precision. Someone had been tracking the thefts, noting patterns that pointed toward organized deception rather than random pilfering. Her careful efforts to spread the burden across multiple sources had actually made the situation more suspicious rather than less so. "Food goes missing in winter," she said with what she hoped sounded like casual dismissal. "Stores run low. People become careless with what they have left. It's hardly evidence of deliberate theft." "Perhaps," Thorvald replied, "but combine it with reports of strange sounds near the longhouse, and a pattern begins to emerge that demands investigation." The words struck her like physical blows. How much did they know? How close were they to discovering Björn's hiding place? The thought of him being dragged before this council, subjected to judgment by men who would see only Ragnar's son rather than the gentle healer who had saved her father's life, filled her with protective fury that was difficult to conceal. "What kind of investigation?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the chaos in her thoughts. "A thorough search of the longhouse and its surroundings," Jarl Erik announced. "If someone is hiding contraband or harboring enemies, we will discover them. The search will begin at dawn tomorrow." The timeline left her precious little time to act. Getting Bjorn away from the village before discovery required careful planning and considerable resources, things she did not currently possess. Yet the alternative was unthinkable. She had seen what Norse justice looked like when applied to enemies and traitors. It was swift, brutal, and final. "I should return to my father," she said, manufacturing an excuse to leave before her expression betrayed the desperation that threatened to overwhelm her composure. "Of course," the Jarl agreed. "But Astrid, if you know anything about these disturbances, anything at all, it would be better to speak now, rather than wait for discovery to force the truth into the open." The offer of clemency hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread. She could end this now, confess everything, throw herself on the council's mercy, and hope that her years of faithful service might earn consideration for whatever punishment they deemed appropriate. It would be the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice that protected her own interests above all else. "I know nothing," she lied, the words burning her throat like strong wine. The walk back to her dwelling felt like a journey through hostile territory, where every shadow might conceal an enemy, and every friendly face might mask suspicion. Gunnar followed at a distance that suggested continued surveillance rather than familial concern. Her own nephew had become a threat to be managed rather than a source of support. She found Bjorn sitting beside her father's bed. The two of them engaged in quiet conversation about healing techniques and the proper preparation of medicinal compounds. The sight of them together, the young healer and the old warrior, finding common ground in shared knowledge, made her heart ache with possibilities that would never be allowed to flourish. "We need to talk," she said, her tone conveying urgency without alarming her father. They moved to the far corner of the dwelling, where whispered conversation would not carry to potentially listening ears. Bjorn's face grew grave as she described the council's suspicions and plans for tomorrow's search. "I should surrender myself," he said quietly. "Face whatever judgment they deem appropriate. You've done enough, risked too much already." "No," she replied with fierce certainty. "I won't let them destroy you for your father's choices, especially now that I understand what those choices really meant." "Then what do you propose?" "We leave tonight," she said, the decision crystallizing as she spoke. "Get you away from here before they can discover your presence." "And go where?" "I have no money, no allies, no safe haven waiting." "We'll figure that out," she promised, though she had no idea how such a thing might be accomplished. For now, survival matters more than comfort. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their planning, sending both of them into defensive positions that spoke of shared awareness of their precarious situation. Yet it was only Ingrid the Wise, arriving for her evening check on Astrid's father's condition. The healer's knowing eyes took in the scene with uncomfortable perception, Bjorn's presence, the whispered conversation, the tension that filled the air like smoke from a poorly banked fire. "I see our patient has been receiving additional care," she observed, her tone carefully neutral. "This is—" Astrid began, but Ingrid raised a hand to forestall explanation. "I know who he is," the older woman said simply. "The question is what you intend to do about it before tomorrow's search discovers what the council already suspects." The hidden scroll lay unrolled across Astrid's wooden table like an accusation written in fading ink. Bjorn's hands trembled as he smoothed the ancient parchment, its surface marked with runic messages that had traveled across years and continents to reach this moment of revelation. The document bore the unmistakable signs of desperate composition, hurried strokes, ink blots where emotion had overwhelmed careful penmanship, corrections that spoke of a writer struggling to find adequate words for impossible truths. "I've carried this since my mother's death," Björn said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She made me promise to keep it safe, but never told me what it contained. I couldn't read the runes until you taught me their meanings." Ingrid leaned closer, her experienced eyes scanning the ancient script with the focused attention of someone accustomed to deciphering difficult texts. As a keeper of village lore and traditional knowledge, she possessed skills that went beyond healing, the ability to read old writings, interpret legal documents, and understand the complex codes that Norse scribes had used to preserve sensitive information. "This is Ragnar's hand," she confirmed after several moments of careful study. "I remember his writing from treaties he helped negotiate with Saxon merchants. But these words, they tell a very different story than the one we've believed all these years." Astrid felt the world shifting beneath her feet as Ingrid began to read aloud, translating the runic text into spoken words that struck like hammer blows against everything she thought she understood about the past. "To my beloved Sigrid and the son I may never see again, if you read these words, then I have failed in my attempt to find a path that preserves all the lives I was sworn to protect. The intelligence I received spoke truly of rich monastery treasures, but it concealed a deeper horror that I discovered too late to prevent. The Saxon lord who provided information planned to use our raid as justification for a massacre of Norse settlements along the coast. Our attack would give him cause to brand all our people as pirates and murderers, deserving of extermination." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, each sentence rewriting history with devastating clarity. Astrid sank onto the wooden bench, her legs suddenly unable to support the weight of this revelation. "I learned of this plot 3 days before our departure," Ingrid continued, her voice growing heavy with the implications of what she was reading. "Saxon forces were already moving into position to attack Nordmark, Ironhold, and 5 other settlements. They waited only for our raid to begin, planning to claim self-defense while they slaughtered women and children in their beds. I faced a choice no man should ever face: warn the enemy and accept the death of my kinsman, or stay silent and watch our entire people face annihilation." Björn's face had gone ashen as the full scope of his father's dilemma became clear. Not simple betrayal motivated by greed, but an impossible choice between 2 sets of lives, the warriors he would lead into ambush or the hundreds of innocents who would die if Saxon armies found justification for their planned massacre. "I chose to save the many at the cost of the few," Ingrid read on, her own voice beginning to crack with emotion. "I sent warning to the monastery, knowing it would mean death for brave warriors who trusted my guidance. Freydis, Thormund, Olaf the Bold, their blood stains my hands as surely as if I had cut their throats myself. Yet in the darkness of my guilt, I tell myself that their sacrifice saved 7 villages, protected hundreds of children who sleep safely tonight because 37 warriors died to preserve them. The silence that followed was deafening. 20 years of hatred, 20 years of justified anger, 20 years of viewing Ragnar as the embodiment of treachery, all of it crumbling like a poorly built wall under the weight of truth finally revealed. Astrid found herself thinking of Freydis, remembering her shield sister's fierce protectiveness toward children and her often-spoken dream of someday having little ones of her own. Would Freydis have understood Ragnar's choice? Would she have forgiven the man who caused her death if she had known it was done to save innocent lives? "There's more," Ingrid said gently, continuing with the scroll's final paragraphs. "The Saxon lord's plot failed when his king learned of the planned massacre and forbade it, declaring such actions beneath the dignity of Christian warriors. My betrayal achieved its purpose. Our people live, our settlements remain safe, our children grow to adulthood in peace. Yet the cost will haunt me until I join the gods in whatever hall awaits oathbreakers and kinslayers." The final section contained Ragnar's farewell to his family, words of love and regret that painted a picture of a man destroyed by choices that offered no good options. He had lived in exile, wandering foreign lands with the weight of his decision, crushing his spirit day by day. His early death had come as a mercy, ending years of self-imposed torment that no amount of justification could ease. Tell our son that his father was not evil, merely weak when strength was most needed. Tell him that some choices steal the soul, even when they save the body, and that wisdom sometimes wears the mask of betrayal. Most importantly, tell him that love can drive men to commit acts that appear monstrous but serve purposes greater than individual honor or glory. Björn wept openly as the reading concluded, tears streaming down his face as 20 years of questions finally found their answers. His father had not been a simple traitor motivated by greed, but a man torn apart by impossible circumstances, who had chosen to sacrifice his own honor to protect innocent lives. My mother knew, he whispered through his tears. She knew the whole truth but never told me. She protected me from the weight of it. Let me grow up, believing my father was simply a flawed man, rather than what? Astrid asked gently. Rather than a hero who saved hundreds of lives at the cost of his own soul, Björn replied, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and grief that spoke of inherited burdens finally understood. The revelation transformed not just their understanding of the past, but their perception of the present crisis. Björn was not simply the son of a traitor hiding from justified vengeance. He was the heir to a man who had made the ultimate sacrifice to protect innocent lives, a legacy that carried its own weight of honor despite the pain it had caused. The village council must know, Ingrid said firmly. This changes everything about how we should view Ragnar's actions and, by extension, how we should treat his son. Will they believe it? Astrid asked, though she was no longer certain she cared about official approval of what had become a deeply personal mission. They'll have to, Ingrid replied, with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the final authority on matters of historical interpretation. This scroll bears Ragnar's seal and personal marks that cannot be forged. More importantly, it explains details about the Saxon plot that only someone with inside knowledge could have known. Yet, even as hope began to kindle in Astrid's chest, she recognized the dangers that remained. 20 years of viewing Ragnar as a villain would not be easily overturned, regardless of new evidence. Some members of the community had built their sense of righteousness around hatred for the betrayer. Asking them to abandon that foundation might prove more difficult than simply accepting new facts. We need to move carefully, she warned. Present this information in a way that allows people to change their minds without losing face. Tomorrow's council meeting, Ingrid suggested. Before the search begins, I can request permission to share new information about historical events that bear on current circumstances. The formal setting will give weight to the revelation while allowing the council to adjust their position without appearing foolish. The plan offered hope, but also terrifying risk. If the council rejected the evidence or chose to ignore its implications, Björn's situation would become even more precarious. The knowledge of Ragnar's true motivations might actually make some people more determined to punish his son, viewing the scroll as an attempt to justify the unjustifiable. As they discussed the details of tomorrow's presentation, the sound of approaching footsteps sent all three into defensive positions. Yet it was only Astrid's father, risen from his sickbed despite his recent illness, to join their urgent conference. I heard voices, he said, settling carefully onto the bench beside his daughter. And I suspect this conversation concerns matters that touched my own life during those dark days. Astrid quickly summarized the scroll's revelations, watching her father's face as understanding dawned in his eyes. His reaction was immediate and decisive, not surprise, but rather the satisfaction of someone whose long-held suspicions had finally been confirmed. I knew there was more to the story, he said with quiet conviction. Ragnar was many things, but a simple traitor was never one of them. The timing was too convenient, the results too perfectly calculated to destroy our enemy's larger plans. I always suspected we were missing crucial pieces of the truth. His Cries' endorsement carried weight that might prove vital in tomorrow's confrontation with village authority. As one of the few surviving witnesses to events 20 years past, his testimony could provide the credibility needed to make the council take these revelations seriously. Freydis's battle axe hung on its leather thong like a sleeping serpent waiting to strike. The weapon's steel head bore the patina of age and careful maintenance, its edge honed to razor sharpness despite years of disuse. Carved runes along the handle spelled out her shield sister's name and the oath they had sworn together to stand side by side against all enemies, to share whatever fate the gods decreed, to honor each other's memory should one fall before the other. Astrid lifted the axe from its place on the wall, feeling the familiar weight settle into her grip with muscle memory that transcended the years since she had last wielded it in anger. The weapon had been Freydis's pride, forged by the finest smith in their homeland and blessed by the priests of Thor before their first raid together. Now it would serve a different purpose, not to take life, but to preserve it against those who would destroy innocence for the crimes of a father. Dawn was still hours away, but the village stirred with premature activity that spoke of secrets poorly kept and tensions running high. Through her small window, Astrid could see torches moving through the settlement as council members and their supporters began gathering for what they clearly expected to be a day of revelations and justice. The formal search of the longhouse would begin at first light, but informal surveillance had already commenced. "They know something," Gunnar said from the doorway, his voice heavy with the weight of divided loyalties. "Eric has doubled the watch around the longhouse and posted men at every path leading out of the village. Whatever you're planning, Aunt, it may already be too late." Her nephew's presence complicated an already dangerous situation. As a warrior sworn to the Jarl's service, he was bound by oaths that superseded family ties when village security was at stake. Yet the pain in his voice suggested he understood the impossible position his earlier suspicions had created for everyone involved. "What I'm planning," Astrid replied carefully, "is to ensure that justice is based on truth rather than assumption. And if the truth doesn't match what people want to hear, then we'll discover whether this village values wisdom more than vengeance." Björn emerged from the corner, where he had been preparing his own meager possessions for whatever lay ahead. The young man had armed himself with nothing more dangerous than his mother's healing knife, but he carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone prepared to face whatever judgment awaited. The transformation from terrified prisoner to resolute young man spoke of inner strength that his father's blood had not corrupted. "I've been thinking about what Ingrid said," Björn announced, "about presenting the scroll to the council as evidence. There's something else they need to see, something that might help them understand my father's character beyond his final desperate choice." From beneath his torn clothing, he produced a small wooden box that had somehow escaped his captor's notice during his imprisonment. The container bore careful craftsmanship that spoke of loving attention to detail, its surface marked with protective runes and bound with strips of precious silver that transformed a simple storage vessel into something approaching art. "My mother's letters," he explained, opening the box to reveal dozens of carefully preserved parchments. "Every message my father sent during his years of exile. They tell the story of a man struggling to live with choices that saved lives but destroyed his soul." Astrid accepted one of the letters, her eyes scanning text written in Ragnar's familiar hand, but bearing a tone of weary sadness that spoke of years spent in self-imposed torment. The words painted a picture of genuine remorse, coupled with quiet pride in having prevented a massacre, a man who understood the cost of his decision but would make the same choice again if circumstances demanded it. "These could change everything," she murmured, recognizing the potential impact such personal testimony might have on minds already wavering between old certainties and new understanding. "Or they could make everything worse," Gunnar warned. Some people prefer simple villains to complex heroes. The idea that Ragnar was a tragic figure rather than a straightforward traitor might threaten assumptions that have shaped this village's identity for 20 years. The observation carried uncomfortable truth. Human nature often preferred clear moral boundaries to the messy complexity of real motivation and difficult choices. Asking the council to abandon their comfortable hatred in favor of nuanced understanding would require courage that not all possessed. Ingrid arrived as the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, her healer's bag supplemented by a leather satchel that contained additional documents she had gathered during the night. As keeper of village records and traditional lore, she possessed access to historical materials that might support their case trade agreements, treaty negotiations, and other documents that could corroborate details mentioned in Ragnar's scroll. "I've found supporting evidence," she announced without preamble. "Records of the Saxon lord who planned the massacre, documentation of troop movements that match Ragnar's timeline, even correspondence between Saxon officials discussing the plot's failure and their disappointment at losing justification for broader military action. The additional evidence strengthened their position considerably, transforming what might have been dismissed as forgery or wishful thinking into a coherent historical narrative supported by multiple independent sources. Yet, Astrid recognized that facts alone might not be sufficient to overcome emotions that had been festering for 2 decades. "How many council members can we count on?" she asked. "Eric is fair-minded but traditional," Ingrid replied thoughtfully. "He'll listen to evidence, but won't want to appear weak by changing established positions. Thorvald has always been suspicious of simple explanations. He might be our strongest supporter. The younger members will follow whoever seems to represent village consensus. And opposition? Bjorn Ironfist lost his brother in the ambush. He's viewed Ragnar's betrayal as personal injury that demands vengeance. Olaf the Tall has built his reputation on stories of that battle and won't want his heroic narrative complicated by moral ambiguity. They'll fight hard against any attempt to rehabilitate Ragnar's memory. The political dynamics painted a picture of a floon, a community divided not just by opinion, but by personal investment in competing versions of the truth. Some council members had genuine stakes in maintaining the existing narrative, regardless of what new evidence might suggest. As they finalized their strategy for the morning's confrontation, the sound of marching feet announced the approach of armed warriors tasked with conducting the official search. Time had run out for preparation within hours. Björn's presence would be discovered, and the council would be forced to render judgment based on whatever information they possessed at that moment. "I should go with them," Björn said, rising from his seat with calm determination. "Face whatever comes openly, rather than hiding like a criminal." "No," Astrid replied firmly. "We present the evidence first, establish the context, and then reveal your presence as part of a larger truth about justice and inherited guilt. Walking into that chamber without preparation would be suicide. Then what do you propose?" "We make our stand here," she said, the decision crystallizing as she spoke. "Force them to come to us, to hear the full story before they can act on incomplete understanding." Gunnar's face went pale as he realized the implications. "You're talking about armed resistance against lawful authority. That's not just protecting Ragnar's son, that's open rebellion. I'm talking about ensuring that justice is based on truth rather than prejudice," Astrid corrected. "If that requires standing against hasty judgment, then so be it." The sound of approaching voices grew louder as the search party organized itself for the systematic examination of every building in the village. Soon they would reach this dwelling, and the careful pretense that had protected Bjorn thus far would collapse into open confrontation. Astrid checked her weapons one final time, the axe that had belonged to Freydis, her own long-neglected sword, the CX that had served her through countless battles. The familiar ritual of preparation brought back memories of other fights, other causes that had demanded courage in the face of overwhelming odds. "What you're contemplating is dangerous beyond measure," Ingrid warned. Even if we convince them of Ragnar's true motivations, the council might still decide that harboring an enemy without permission constitutes treason. Then we'll face that judgment when it comes, Astrid replied. But we'll face it, knowing we stood for something more important than convenient hatred. Björn moved to stand beside her, his presence providing silent support that transcended words. Despite everything he had suffered, despite the danger that surrounded him, he had chosen to trust her judgment and accept whatever consequences their defiance might bring. "My father spent 20 years living with the weight of impossible choices," he said quietly. "Perhaps it's time for his son to make some difficult choices of his own." Through the window, they could see the search party spreading through the village in organized patterns that spoke of military efficiency. Eric Bloodaxe led them personally, his presence lending official weight to what might otherwise have been dismissed as routine investigation. The Jarl's involvement suggested he took the matter seriously. Whether that would work for or against them remained to be seen. "Remember," Ingrid said as she prepared to depart for the council chamber, where she would attempt to lay the groundwork for their revelations, "we're not just fighting for Björn's life. We're fighting for the right to choose mercy over vengeance, understanding over hatred, wisdom over the easier path of inherited prejudice." The words carried weight that extended far beyond their immediate crisis. What happened in the next few hours would define not just Björn's fate, but the kind of community Nordmark would become, one that learned from its mistakes, or one that remained trapped by the limitations of its own anger. As Ingrid departed to begin their desperate gambit, Astrid found herself thinking of Freydis and wondering what her shield sister would have made of this moment. Would she have approved of using her axe to protect the son of the man whose betrayal had cost her life? The answer came with surprising clarity. Freydis had always chosen the harder path when it led toward justice, even when justice wore an unexpected face. The sacred hearthfire had burned continuously in the center of Nordmark's longhouse for 3 generations, its flames representing the eternal spirit of the community that gathered around its warmth. Fed by oak logs that crackled with ancient authority, the fire cast dancing shadows across the carved pillars, while its smoke rose through the opening in the roof toward whatever gods might be watching the drama about to unfold. Astrid stood before the assembled village, with Freydis's axe hanging at her side, and 20 years of accumulated grief transformed into steely resolve. Beside her, Björn maintained the quiet dignity of someone who had accepted whatever fate awaited, though his hands trembled slightly as he faced the angry murmur of voices that filled the great hall. Jarl Erik occupied his carved chair with the bearing of a leader who understood that the decisions made in the next few moments would echo through generations. The justice hammer rested across his knees, its polished surface reflecting firelight that seemed to pulse with the weight of impending judgment. His expression revealed nothing of his thoughts, but his stillness spoke of careful consideration rather than hasty anger. "You harbor an enemy of this village," Thorvald the Grey declared, his weathered features twisted with outrage that had been building since the search party's discovery. "The son of the betrayer who cost us 37 good warriors, hidden like a criminal in our very midst. I harbor the son of a man you never truly understood," Astrid replied, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "And before you render judgment based on old hatred, you will hear the truth about what happened 20 years ago." Björn Ironfist stepped forward, his massive frame radiating the kind of controlled violence that made seasoned warriors step back in recognition of a dangerous opponent. "There is no truth beyond treachery," he growled. "Ragnar's spawn deserves the same fate his father should have received, death without honor, unmourned and unremembered. My brother died in that ambush," he continued, his voice rising with emotion that had been festering for 2 decades. "Cut down by Saxon swords while following intelligence that Ragnar himself provided. What truth could possibly justify that betrayal?" Ingrid the Wise rose from her place among the elders, the scroll and supporting documents clutched in her hands like weapons of a different kind. The truth that 7 villages full of children live today because of choices that cost Ragnar everything he valued, she announced. The truth that your brother's death, and Freydis's death, and the deaths of 35 other brave warriors prevented a massacre that would have claimed hundreds of innocent lives. The murmur of voices died to complete silence as the implications of her words settled over the assembly. This was not the simple narrative of greed and betrayal they had accepted for 20 years, but something far more complex and morally challenging. Lies, Björn Ironfist declared, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. Convenient stories manufactured to excuse the inexcusable. Read the evidence, Ingrid challenged, unrolling Ragnar's scroll for all to see. Written in his own hand, sealed with his personal mark, corroborated by Saxon documents that describe the failed plot in detail. As she began to read aloud, the great hall grew so quiet that the only sounds were the crackling of the hearth fire and the whisper of wind through the roof opening. Ragnar's words painted a picture of impossible choices and sacrificial love that transformed him from villain to tragic hero. A man who had chosen to save the many at the cost of the few, accepting eternal dishonor to prevent genocide. Even if this is true, Olaf the Tall interjected when the reading concluded, it changes nothing about the son's guilt. The blood of betrayers runs in his veins, marking him as dangerous to our community. Bjorn stepped forward, his voice steady despite the hostility that surrounded him like a physical force. I carry my father's blood, he said simply, but I choose my own path. Judge me by my actions, not by his choices. And what actions would those be? Jarl Erik asked, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began. What have you done to earn consideration from those whose kinsmen died because of your father's decision? The question offered an opportunity that Astrid seized immediately. He saved my father's life, she announced. Used healing knowledge that none of our traditional remedies possessed. Risked discovery to tend a dying old man with no thought of reward or recognition. One act of kindness doesn't erase a legacy of betrayal, Thorvald observed, though his tone suggested he was genuinely considering the evidence rather than rejecting it outright. No, Astrid agreed, but it suggests that sons need not be condemned for their father's sins, regardless of how necessary those sins might have been. The crowd stirred restlessly as competing loyalties and fresh understanding created fractures in what had seemed like unified opposition. Some faces showed the first signs of doubt about conclusions they had held for 20 years, while others hardened into defensive anger at having their certainties challenged. I propose a test, Gunnar said suddenly, his voice cutting through the rising tension. Let Bjorn prove his worth through actions, rather than words. If he truly possesses his father's courage, let him demonstrate it in service to this community. Jarl Erik leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. What kind of test? Combat, Bjorn Ironfist declared before Gunnar could respond. Let him face a champion in single combat. If he survives, the gods will have spoken in his favor. If he dies, the matter ends with his death. The suggestion sent a ripple of approval through portions of the crowd who preferred simple solutions to complex moral questions. Trial by combat offered clean resolution. Victory would prove divine favor, while defeat would eliminate the problem entirely. Yet Astrid recognized the trap hidden within the proposal. Bjorn was a healer, not a warrior. Pitting him against a seasoned fighter like Bjorn Ironfist would be little different from execution, merely dressed in the clothes of divine judgment. I accept, Bjorn said quietly, his words carrying clearly across the suddenly silent hall. The young man's calm acceptance of what amounted to a death sentence sent shock through the assembly. Even his opponents seemed surprised by his willingness to face certain doom rather than beg for mercy or attempt to flee. You don't have to do this, Astrid whispered urgently. There are other ways. No, Bjorn replied with gentle certainty. My father spent 20 years living with the weight of impossible choices. Perhaps it's time for his son to make a choice of his own, to prove that love and courage can transcend the sins of the past. As the crowd began to reorganize itself around the prospect of imminent combat, Astrid felt the weight of Freydis's axe at her side and knew that the moment of truth had finally arrived. The judgment stone stood split down its center like a wound in the earth itself, the ancient crack running deep through granite that had witnessed countless decisions over the generations. Legend claimed the split had appeared the day the Sistine Gedmu, village's first Jarl, had made an unjust ruling, the gods expressing their displeasure through this permanent scar in the sacred rock. Now it seemed prophetic, a physical manifestation of the community's division over questions that had no easy answers. Warriors formed a circle around the combat area, while the rest of the village pressed close to witness what many believed would be a swift execution disguised as divine judgment. Björn Ironfist stripped to the waist, his scarred torso telling the story of decades spent in battle against human enemies and natural hardships alike. His chosen weapon was a war axe, whose blade had tasted blood in a dozen raids, its edge honed to lethal sharpness for this moment of reckoning. Björn faced him with nothing more than his mother's healing knife and whatever courage he could summon from depths that had never been tested in mortal combat. The young man's slender build seemed almost childlike compared to his opponent's massive frame, yet something in his stance spoke of inner resolve that transcended physical limitations. "Last chance to beg for mercy," Iron Fist growled, rolling his shoulders in preparation for violence that had become as natural as breathing. "My father never begged," Björn replied quietly. "Neither will I." The combat began with Iron Fist's charge, his war axe whistling through the air in an overhead strike designed to end the fight before it could truly begin. Yet Björn was no longer where the blow landed, having stepped aside with fluid grace that spoke of reflexes honed by years of avoiding dangerous situations rather than seeking them. What followed was not the traditional clash of steel against steel that the audience expected, but something closer to a deadly dance. Björn used his speed and agility to stay ahead of his opponent's powerful but somewhat predictable attacks, turning the larger man's momentum against him whenever possible. "Stand and fight like a warrior," Iron Fist bellowed after several unsuccessful attempts to corner his elusive opponent. "I fight like a healer," Björn replied, his breathing still controlled despite the exertion, preserving life rather than taking it. The observation struck deeper than any physical blow might have managed. Here was the son of a betrayer, demonstrating the same instinct to protect rather than destroy that had motivated his father's impossible choice 20 years ago. The parallel was not lost on observers who had come, expecting simple vengeance. Iron Fist's frustration grew as his experience advantage failed to compensate for Björn's unexpected fighting style. The young man seemed to anticipate each attack, flowing around violence like water around stone. More troubling still, he consistently passed up opportunities to strike back when his opponent overextended, choosing evasion over aggression even when counterattacks might have ended the fight in his favor. "Why won't you strike?" Astrid called out, her voice carrying concern that transcended tactical considerations. "Because proving I can kill doesn't prove I should live," Björn answered, dodging another powerful swing that split the air where his head had been moments before. The response sent murmurs through the crowd as witnesses began to recognize something unprecedented in their experience. Here was a young man fighting for his life, yet refusing to take life in return, demonstrating a strength that had nothing to do with physical prowess and everything to do with moral conviction. Jarl Erik watched from his position near the Judgment Stone, his expression unreadable as the combat revealed layers of complexity that simple trial by battle was not designed to address. The justice hammer remained across his knees, but his grip had relaxed as he observed a kind of courage he had never encountered before. The turning point came when Iron Fist, driven to rage by his inability to land a decisive blow, overcommitted to a massive swing that left him temporarily off balance. Bjorn could have ended the fight then, driving his knife into an exposed back or slashing the tendons that would cripple his opponent. Instead, he stepped forward and steadied the larger man, preventing a fall that might have resulted in serious injury. "What are you doing?" Iron Fist gasped, confused by assistance from someone he was trying to kill. "What my father would have done," Bjorn replied. "Choosing protection over destruction, even when destruction would be easier." The gesture broke something in Iron Fist's rage, replacing fury with bewilderment that bordered on admiration. He lowered his axe and stepped back, no longer certain that continuing the fight served any useful purpose. "Enough," Jarl Erik declared, rising from his seat with the authority that ended all disputes. "I have seen what I needed to see." The crowd fell silent as their leader approached the judgment stone, the justice hammer now gripped in both hands as he prepared to render the decision that would determine not just Bjorn's fate, but the kind of community Nordmark would become. "This young man has shown us something we had forgotten," Erik announced, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled villagers. "That true strength lies not in the ability to destroy enemies, but in the wisdom to turn them into allies." He paused beside the cracked stone, placing one hand on each side of the ancient split, as if drawing strength from the division itself. "Ragnar's betrayal cost us 37 brave warriors, but it saved 7 villages full of children. His son has shown us that courage can take many forms, including the courage to show mercy when vengeance would be easier." Thorvald the Grey stepped forward. His weathered face creased with the effort of reconsidering beliefs he had held for decades. "What would you have us do, Jarl? Accept him as one of our own? I would have us remember that we are stronger when we decide. Choose wisdom over hatred," Erik replied. "Bjorn has proven himself worthy of our protection, just as his father proved himself worthy of our understanding, even if that understanding came 20 years too late." The decision sent ripples through the crowd as old certainties gave way to new possibilities. Spring arrived in Nordmark with the gentle persistence of hope, slowly displacing winter's harsh certainties. The new memorial stone stood where the old judgment stone had been, its fresh carved surface bearing names that told a more complete story than previous monuments had dared to attempt. Freydis the Bold, Thormund Ironarm, Olaf Redshield, all the warriors who had died in that Saxon ambush 20 years ago were remembered with honor. But now, carved with equal prominence, was Ragnar the Heavy-Hearted, acknowledged at last as a man who had saved hundreds of lives at the cost of his own honor and peace. Astrid traced the new runes with weathered fingers, feeling a closure that 20 years of grief had failed to provide. The stone's inscription spoke of sacrifice in service of the innocent, of choices that required men to surrender everything they valued to protect those who could not protect themselves. It was not the simple heroism that made for easy songs around hearth fires, but it was truth complicated, painful, and ultimately redemptive. "The carving is well done," Bjorn observed, settling beside her on the wooden bench that the village council had placed near the memorial. At 22, 4 years older than when she had first found him chained in darkness, he had grown into the kind of man his father might have been proud to know. The healing arts he had learned from his Eastern mother now served the entire community, while his gentle strength had earned respect that transcended the circumstances of his arrival. "Ingrid suggested the wording," Astrid replied. "She said the gods prefer complex truths to simple lies." The village around them bustled with the activities of a community that had learned to balance tradition with growth. Children who had been born after the Great Revelation played games that incorporated new stories alongside ancient legends. Their laughter carried no echo of the hatred that had once defined their elders' relationship with the past. Gunnar approached with the easy confidence of a man who had found his place in a world that made sense again. At 36, he had assumed many of the responsibilities that age and wisdom made natural, serving as liaison between the village council and the younger generation of warriors who would someday lead Nordmark into an uncertain future. The shipwrights say the new trading vessel will be ready by midsummer, he reported, settling onto the grass near the memorial. Björn's contacts in the eastern lands have expressed interest in establishing regular commerce, healing herbs and metallurgy techniques in exchange for our amber and iron work. The trading proposal represented more than simple economic opportunity. It symbolized Nordmark's willingness to engage with the broader world rather than retreating into defensive isolation. Björn's foreign connections, once viewed with suspicion, now served as bridges to knowledge and prosperity that benefited everyone. Your father would have appreciated the irony, Astrid told Björn with gentle humor. His son bringing the village into contact with the very peoples he was accused of favoring over his own kinsmen. He would have appreciated the peace more, Björn replied. The letters my mother saved spoke often of his dreams for a world where conflicts could be resolved through understanding rather than bloodshed. Those letters, along with the scroll that had revealed the truth about Ragnar's betrayal, now resided in the village's expanding collection of historical documents. Ingrid had insisted on preserving them, not just as evidence, but as reminders that truth often wore more complex faces than first impressions suggested. The sound of approaching voices announced the arrival of the afternoon's teaching session. A dozen young women, ranging in age from 16 to 25, gathered around Astrid with the enthusiasm of students who had found instruction worth their attention. She had begun teaching them the arts of warfare and strategy 6 months ago, not because the village expected imminent conflict, but because knowledge itself was a form of strength that circumstances might someday require. Today we discuss the difference between courage and recklessness, Astrid announced as her students settled into attentive positions. Can anyone tell me why that distinction matters? Because courage serves a purpose larger than itself, replied Sigrid, a blacksmith's daughter whose quick mind had made her the group's unofficial leader, while recklessness serves only the ego of the person displaying it. Exactly. True courage often requires us to make choices that appear weak to those who value simple solutions over complex wisdom. The lesson that followed drew heavily on the events that had brought Björn into their community, using recent history to illustrate principles that might otherwise have remained abstract. The young women listened with the intensity of those who understood they were receiving more than technical instruction. They were learning how to think about problems that had no easy answers. As the session concluded and the students dispersed to their various responsibilities, Astrid found herself alone again with Björn and Gunnar. The late afternoon sun painted the memorial stone in golden light that made the carved names seem to glow with their own inner fire. "I've been thinking about legacy," she said, breaking a comfortable silence that had settled over them like a familiar blanket. "What we leave behind when our own stories end." "And what conclusions have you reached?" Björn asked. "That the best legacies aren't the ones we plan, but the ones that grow from choices made when no one is watching, and history will never record our names." The observation carried weight that extended beyond philosophical speculation. Each of them had made decisions that would echo through generations in ways they could not foresee. Astrid's choice to show mercy rather than seek vengeance, Björn's willingness to face certain death rather than compromise his principles, Gunnar's courage to support truth over comfortable lies. Speaking of legacy, Gunnar said with a smile that suggested he was about to share welcome news. Ingrid has agreed to train Björn in the formal arts of record-keeping and historical preservation. She says the village needs someone young enough to carry our stories forward for the next 50 years. The appointment represented more than practical succession planning. It was a statement of trust that placed the son of the great betrayer in charge of preserving the stake, in memory of the very people his father's actions had affected. The symbolism was intentional and profound, forgiveness made manifest through responsibility freely given. As evening approached, and the three companions prepared to return to their various dwellings, Astrid took one last look at the memorial stone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and fresh opportunities for both wisdom and folly. But tonight, in the gentle light of spring's return, she felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had chosen the harder path and found it led to places worth reaching. The names carved in stone would endure long after those who remembered the original pain had passed into whatever realm awaited beyond life's final threshold. Yet the story they told of sacrifice and redemption, of inherited guilt transformed into earned grace, would continue to offer guidance to those who face their own impossible choices in times yet to come. Some truths, Astrid reflected, were worth the pain required to discover them.